1982 is often referred to as the year that made the 80s. 1982 saw the release of seminal and cult genre films such as E.T., Blade Runner, Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, The Road Warrior, The Secret of Nim, The Dark Crystal, The Thing, Tron, Beastmaster, First Blood, The Last Unicorn, Rocky III, and Poltergeist. So many iconic pop and nerd culture icons and cult classics were released that it is believed to be a watershed year. What if I told you that 1982 is not the dawn of a new era, but the culmination of a wave that started long before? 1982? 1977 says, "Hold my beer."
Initiate sequence. Retrotron Entertainment presents.
That's 70s Nerd. 1977 was the fruition of a decade-long growth of interest in science fiction and fantasy that started with the so-called campus cults around Frank Herbert's Dune and J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. Let's take a look at the groundbreaking year of 1977, a year I believe laid the groundwork for the nerdy pop culture of the 1980s. It would be impossible to list every genre-themed movie, novel, and comic book published in the year 1977, but here are some of the highlights. Publishing. 1977 was a big year for Tolkien fans, giving us the first of three classic Brothers Hildebrandt Tolkien calendars, Humphrey Carpenter's J.R.R. Tolkien, a biography, and most importantly, 1977 saw the publication of Tolkien's Middle-earth prequel saga, The Silmarillion. Nerds were treated to an endless buffet of sci-fi and fantasy fiction in 1977. Frank Herbert published The Dos Sedai Experiment, which was nominated for the prestigious Locus Award. Anne McCaffrey published Dragon Singer, Volume 4 of her sprawling Pern saga. Alan Dean Foster, coming off his best-selling blockbuster 1976 novelization of the upcoming movie Star Wars, published two original novels, The End of the Matter and Orphan Star. Science fiction grandmaster Frederik Pohl published the first of his legendary Heechee saga, Gateway. Logan's World, the sequel to Logan's Run, was published. Larry Niven and Jerry Pournelle published Lucifer's Hammer, a book that would later blatantly inspire the disaster movies Armageddon and Deep Impact in the 1990s. The original plot to Lucifer's Hammer became the best-selling alien invasion novel Footfall in the 1980s. Jack L. Chalker's Midnight at the Well of Souls sold over 1 million copies in 1977. Richard Adams published his long-awaited follow-up to Watership Down, The Plague Dogs. Philip K. Dick published his career-defining novel, A Scanner Darkly. T.H. White published the coda to his classic Once and Future King, The Book of Merlin. Stephen R. Donaldson published the first 2 volumes of his epic fantasy saga, The Chronicles of Thomas Covenant. Piers Anthony published the first of his best-selling Xanth fantasy series, A Spell for Chameleon. Susan Cooper published the conclusion of her Dark is Rising sequence, Silver on the Tree. And most importantly, Del Rey published the debut novel of Terry Brooks, The Sword of Shannara. The Sword of Shannara ushered in the era of door-stopping fantasy epics that ruled the 1980s and after. The Sword of Shannara sold 125,000 copies before the end of 1977 and spent months on the bestseller lists. The New York Times published this in 1977. If you have any doubt that the American reading public is reveling in fantasy, consider the bestseller lists this week. J.R.R. Tolkien's novel of Middle-earth, The Silmarillion, has an ever stronger claim to the #1 fiction spot. Its increase in sales during the past 7 days in the 1,400 bookstores reporting to us, equaling the total sales of the #2 novel, The Thornbirds. A second fantasy appears on the list this week, number 15, T.H. White's The Book of Merlin. Fantasy rates high among paperback buyers as well. Number 5 on the mass market list is Star Wars. Number 8 on the trade paperback list is The Sword of Shannara, a first novel by Terry Brooks. Moreover, many stores across the country are reporting considerable sales of the paperback edition of Tolkien's The Hobbit, which blazed the trail for the Silmarillion. Comics. Nerds had piles and piles of cool comics to entertain themselves with in 1977. Here's just a few of the more important titles and events. Jonah Hex, number 1. Black Lightning, number 1. Black Panther, number 1. Godzilla, number 1. John Carter, Warlord of Mars, number 1. Logan's Run, number 1. Marvel Super Special, number 1, featuring Kiss. Heavy Metal, number 1, introduced American audiences to French comic books. The first issue of 2000 AD was published in the UK. Judge Dredd debuted in the second issue of 2000 AD. The first issue of Dave Sim's controversial, massive, 300-issue epic, Cerebus the Aardvark, was published. Artist John Byrne began his famed run on Marvel's X-Men with issue number 108. Star Wars number 1 hit the stands and quickly sold out. Stan Lee and John Romita's The Amazing Spider-Man comic strip made its debut in daily newspapers. Simpsons creator Matt Groening published his first Life in Hell comic. Wendy and Richard Pini established Warp Graphics. ElfQuest issue number 1 would be published in February of 1978. Think comic book conventions are a modern phenomenon? No fewer than 19 comic book conventions were held in 1977. Movies! 1977 offered a variety of special effects, animation, sci-fi, horror, and fantasy films for nerds to enjoy on movie night. Airport 77 continued the popular Airport Disaster series. Orca brought terror back to the sea. James Bond starred in The Spy Who Loved Me, which many consider to be Roger Moore's best Bond outing. There was The Car, a new genre of automobile horror that culminated in Stephen King's Christine. Demon Seed gave birth to the possessed robot Proteus. Disney offered up Pete's Dragon and The Rescuers, which was directed by Don Bluth, who would later give us The Secret of Nim in 1982. Decades before The X-Files, we had Capricorn 1. Ray Harryhausen brought us the magic of Dynamation with Sinbad and the Eye of the Tiger. David Lynch released his first film, Eraserhead. Lynch would go on to direct the first film version of Dune in 1984. Kevin Connor concluded his Edgar Rice Burroughs trilogy with The People That Time Forgot. Japan released the feature film version of space battleship Yamato, known in America as Star Blazers. Wizards, directed by Ralph Bakshi. His next film would be the first film adaptation of Lord of the Rings. Steven Spielberg's Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and, of course, George Lucas released the original Star Wars. Television. Nerd culture ruled the airwaves in 1977. Sci-fi, superheroes, and fantasy were on every channel. The $6 Million Man was in its 5th season. The Bionic Woman was in its 3rd season. The Man from Atlantis flopped on TV but is now a cult classic. The Incredible Hulk and The Amazing Spider-Man brought Marvel comic heroes to primetime television. Logan's Run continued the 1976 feature film with new adventures. Quark, a science fiction comedy. In Search Of, with Star Trek's Leonard Nimoy, explored the unexplainable. On Saturday morning, there was Space Academy from Filmation, and Sid and Marty Krofft's Bigfoot and Wild Boy, along with the New Adventures of Batman, which introduced the world to Bat-Mite. Doctor Who aired 3 beloved serials, The Face of Evil, Robots of Death, and The Talons of Weng Chang. In what would become a tradition for George Lucas, long before DVD, Blu-ray, and YouTube, audiences were given an inside look at the special effects process with The Making of Star Wars. Last and certainly not least, Rankin Bass brought J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit to life in a feature-length animated special. 77 was a banner year for Tolkien fans. Music. In 1977, nerds knew how to rock. Here's just a sample of the progressive, fantasy, and sci-fi fueled rock music from 1977. Kansas, Point of No Return. Peter Gabriel's first solo album after leaving Genesis. Yes released one of their most acclaimed albums, Going for the One, featuring the sidelong epic Awaken. Pink Floyd, Animals. Renaissance, Novella. Todd Rundgren's Utopia, Ra. Jethro Tull, Songs from the Wood. Emerson, Lake and Palmer, Works, Volume 1. Hawkwind, a band that once had Elric creator Michael Moorcock as a member, released Quark, Strangeness, and Charm. Styx, The Grand Illusion. Vandergraaf Generator, The Quiet Zone. Rush, A Farewell to Kings. Camel, Rain Dances. Gentle Giant, Missing Piece. ELO, Out of the Blue. Queen, News of the World. Genesis, Seconds Out Live. With Phil Collins replacing Peter Gabriel as lead vocalist, the drum seat was filled by prog rock legend Bill Bruford of Yes and King Crimson fame. David Bowie, Heroes, Brian Eno, Before and After Silence. Brian Eno would go on to compose the theme to David Lynch's Dune. And one of my very favorite albums, Anthony Phillips, The Geese and the Ghost. Movie nerds had two of the all-time greatest soundtracks to listen to, compliments of John Williams, Star Wars, and Close Encounters of the Third Kind. But wait, what about video games? Surely video games were a unique part of the 1980s. Think again. In 1977, the top-selling home video game consoles were Nintendo console, or Color TV game console in Japan, Atari Video Computer System, or Atari VCS, the TRS-80, the Altair 8800, the Commodore PET, and the Apple II. Those are just a few of the reasons why I consider 1977 to be one of the most important years in the history of pop and nerd culture. What do you think? Was 1977 equal to or even superior to 1982 in its movies, television series, novels, comics, and music? Leave a comment below, and always
be groovy, like, comment, share.